Hi everybody, I'm Neil and today I'll be sharing some tips and tricks on how to engage audiences and drive action through data storytelling. So I'd like you to begin by imagining you're presenting some data findings back to an audience. Lots of your audience is going to be engaged. However, there'll be some in your audience that are not engaged. They may be unsure, they may be bored, or they may be confused. So how do we engage this section of our audience? Well, storytelling is a highly effective way of doing so. Why? Well, science proves that the human brain is highly receptive to stories. When we're engaged with stories, we see increased cortical activity via mirroring, whereby between the teller and the listener, there's a mirroring of brain signals, which develops empathy and connection, and neural coupling, whereby when we're engaged with stories, we couple the story to our own experiences and ideas. Alongside this, we see increased hormone release into the body, namely dopamine to help with recall, cortisol to help with attention, and oxytocin to help with empathy and connection. So when we combine the science of storytelling alongside our needs as digital marketers to tell stories with data, it becomes clear data storytelling is the new superpower for marketers of all disciplines. Not just for us as analysts, it's for each and every one of us, regardless of the discipline that we operate in. I'm often asked what data storytelling is, and this tweet sums it up beautifully. Data storytelling is the technique of communicating a compelling story via insights and visualizations derived from data. Put another way, data storytelling has three critical ingredients of insight, visualization, and communication. All three of those need to come together for your data story to engage audiences and drive action as well. But how do we go about doing that? Let's start with insights. Insights are critical. Insights grab attention, giving your story both action and purpose. In fact, a story without insight isn't really a story at all. And where this often falls down is that observations and analysis are often mistaken for insights. However, observations, analysis, and insights are all inextricably linked. And here's how. You can think of this as building a pyramid. At the base of our pyramid, we have observations. Observations are factual and state what has happened. So, for example, we could be in the Google Ads dataset and we observe revenue increasing when branded paid search spend increases. Next on our pyramid, we have analysis. You can think of analysis as combining multiple observations together to provide context. So if we take our example and expand out into the total search landscape, we may want to analyze data in Google Analytics, and we identify a high correlation between brand spend and revenue when considering total search. Then at the top of our pyramid, we have insight. Insights deliver action based on our analysis and observations. So again, if we go back to our example, we've got a hypothesis of branded paid search delivering incremental sales. We then may use a technique such as incrementality testing to prove that branded paid search delivers, for example, £10,000 worth of incremental revenue. And this would be the insight which we would form and shape our story around. So, moving on to our second critical ingredient of data storytelling, and that is visualization. The saying goes, a picture paints 1,000 words, and that couldn't be truer when it comes to data visualization. Why? Well, effective data visualization reduces cognitive load and increases engagement as well. However, the challenge that we have is that default visuals in tools such as Sheets and Excel do the exact opposite. Here's an example here, and I'm sure you're experiencing this right now. It takes high cognitive load to understand this visual. Patterns aren't clear, trends aren't clear, insights aren't clear. Because of the high cognitive load, it's reducing our engagement. So how do we transform this visual? How do we make it effective? How do we reduce cognitive load? How do we increase engagement? Well, I'm going to talk through some tips and tricks on how we can quickly elevate this visual to get it to where it needs to be. Firstly, this is a small one, but bigger in the grand scheme of things. Make sure the background of your visual matches the background of your slide. It makes the visual feel more integrated and creates an initial cognitive shortcut, which eases the cognitive load. Now, we're dealing with trended line graphs here, so the grid lines prove nothing more than a distraction. So let's get rid of them. By removing the grid lines, it draws our attention to the two data sets at hand. However, we can see there's vast scaling between these two different data sets, which makes it difficult to process. So let's add a secondary axis. Adding a secondary axis where the scaling is vast can be transformative. Hopefully you've all now had a hit of dopamine and cortisol, because now you can see a clear pattern between the two data sets. However, because these two data sets are extremely highly correlated, it's actually very difficult to know which data set is which without continually referring to the legend. So how can we create some additional cognitive shortcuts here? One of these would be to vary the visualization type to aid the recall of data. So now our line graph represents hours of sunshine. Our bar chart represents our shark attacks data. We can take this a step further and provide additional distinction through the use of color. And color by association can be particularly powerful here. So, for example, hours of sunshine. We may think of sunshine and think of orange. So let's color that data set orange. Shark attacks, we may think of sharks, the sea, blue. Let's color that data set blue. And furthermore, because we've got two y-axes here, let's color the y-axis labels relative to the data set that it's associated with. Now we've created several cognitive shortcuts. Anything orange, hours of sunshine. Anything blue, it's our shark attacks data. Where we've got line charts, you may want to consider adding data markers to aid pattern and trend recall. Our brains love spotting patterns, so anything we can do to make that easier and reduce that cognitive load is going to help with your visual as well. The use of labels and bolding to remove guesswork is a really nice way to elevate your visual as well. So making sure each of your axes are clearly labeled to provide that clarity of what the chart is telling you, and to use bolding to distinguish the labels from the axes values as well. And then finally, what I would say is, and don't be afraid to do this, land the insight in the title to aid the interpretation of your visual. Tell your audience what the insight is, and then the visualization merely becomes a way of evidencing the insight that you're putting in front of them. So very quickly, we've gone from something like this, requiring high cognitive load, patterns, trends, and insights not clear, through to this, exactly the same underlying data set. However, through some tips and techniques that we've talked through, we've managed to create several cognitive shortcuts, which aids the interpretation of the visual, reduces cognitive load, and increases engagement as a result. So, on to our final critical ingredient of data storytelling, and that's communication. You could think of everything so far as being in a 100-meter race. We're 90 meters in and we're in first position. However, if we don't communicate our story effectively, we'll very quickly go from first position at 90 meters through to last when we cross the finish line. So how do we avoid that? How do we make sure we communicate our story clearly, concisely, and effectively? Well, using a story mountain can help you to do just that. The saying goes, every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can think of the middle of the story as the insight that you're trying to land and the peak of your mountain. That insight needs to have plenty of build-up and context to take you from the beginning of the story to the middle. You land the insight in the middle, and then there's a clear resolution taking you from the middle of the story through to the end. Most stories follow this structure to enable clarity. And I'm going to use the example story of the Three Little Pigs to identify that if any of these key ingredients are missing, the story is frustrating, the story is confusing, and the story lacks engagement. So firstly, build-up and context is critical in data storytelling. One of the biggest mistakes I've made personally, and that I've seen others make, is that we come across an insight, we're super excited about finding that insight, and we want to tell our audience about it straight away. We often forget that our audience don't have the context that we have because they haven't analysed the data like we have. So how does this play out in the story of the Three Little Pigs? Let's imagine we open the story with, the wolf couldn't blow down the house made out of bricks, and the pigs lived all happily ever after, the end. At this point, it's very confusing because we've missed that context. We don't know the role of the wolf in the story. We don't know the materials that we used to build the houses. We don't even know if all the houses stayed upright, whether a gust of wind blew them down, or whether the wolf blew them down. So missing all of this context leads to a confusing story, which lowers our engagement. I mentioned earlier that a story without insight isn't really a story at all. And this is how it plays out in the Three Little Pigs. So for example, let's say we do have our build-up and context. So we know there are 3 pigs building their houses out of straw and wood and bricks. And there's a wolf in the story. And then we jump straight to the end. And 3 pigs lived happily ever after, the end. At which point you're all probably finding this a frustrating story. You're probably thinking, what's the point? Why have you told me this story? This frustration can lead to a lack of engagement. So having an insight in your story is so critical. And then no ending can create a huge frustration for your audience. So we've got our build up and context. We've got our 3 pigs building their houses out of straw and wood and bricks. We've got our wolf in the story, and we know the wolf's trying to blow the houses down. We know the wolf blows the house down made out of straw and wood, but can't blow down the house made out of bricks. And then we end the story there. You're going to have lots of questions. What happened to the wolf? What happened to the 2 pigs whose houses blew down? Did they survive, or did they get eaten by the wolf? What happened to the pig who built the brick house? Did they teach the other pigs how to build brick houses? Did they all live happily ever after in one house? All of those questions, again, lead to confusion, frustration, lower the engagement in the story. So a story mountain is a highly effective technique to make sure that you're considering all the bases. You've got your beginning, your middle, and your end. And if you can follow that structure, then your story won't go far wrong in terms of communication. So let's wrap up our journey of data storytelling today. Science proves that the human brain is highly receptive to stories. When we're engaged with stories, we see increased cortical activity via mirroring, where there's a mirroring of brain signals between the teller and the listener, which develops connection and empathy, and neural coupling. When we're engaged with stories, we couple the story to our own experiences and ideas. Additionally, we see increased hormone release into the body, so dopamine, cortisol, and oxytocin, which helps with recall, attention, and empathy as well. When we combine that science behind storytelling, alongside our needs as digital marketers to tell stories with data, it becomes apparent. Data storytelling is the new superpower for marketers of all disciplines. It's not just for analysts, it's for each and every one of us, regardless of the discipline that we operate in. Data storytelling is the technique of communicating a compelling story via insights and visualizations derived from data. So put another way, data storytelling has 3 critical ingredients of insight, visualization, and communication. All 3 of those need to come together for your data story to engage audiences and drive action. We looked at each of these ingredients individually, and where insights often fall down is a lack of clarity between what's an observation, an analysis, and insight. You can think of observations being factual, analysis being contextual, and insight being actionable. So we did an example whereby we observed data in Google Ads, analyzed data in Google Analytics to get a hypothesis that branded paid search delivers incremental sales, and then we proved that hypothesis using a technique such as incrementality testing to get our insight that branded paid search delivered £10,000 worth of incremental revenue. We talked about effective data visualization and the power behind that. It reduces cognitive load and increases engagement. However, the defaults in tools such as Sheets and Excel do the exact opposite. Charts like this require high cognitive load, patterns and trends aren't clear, insights aren't clear. However, by paying attention to visuals and putting some tips and tricks that we've put in place today, we can quickly transform our visual from something like this to something like this. Exactly the same underlying data set. However, we've created several cognitive shortcuts, we've made the patterns and trends clear, and we've made the insight clear as well, all of which reduces the cognitive load and increases the engagement in the visual and your wider story as well. And then we're to the final ingredient of data storytelling, which is communication. In terms of communication, that is critical in terms of binding your whole story together. Use the concept of a story mountain, where every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Think of the middle of the story as the key insight that you're trying to land. That's supported by build-up, taking you from the beginning to the middle. We land the insight in the middle, and then we have a clear resolution taking us from the middle of the story through to its conclusion. We use the example story of the 3 little pigs to demonstrate that if any of these key elements are missing, the story is confusing, the story is frustrating, and ultimately we lack engagement in the story as a result. So why have I told you all about this today? Well, if we circle right back to the very beginning, if we're presenting data findings back to an audience, we're going to have some in our audience that are not engaged. Storytelling is a highly effective technique to engage our audiences. So ultimately, if we follow the tips, tricks, and frameworks that we've talked through together today, you'll have fewer of these in your audience and many, many more of these. Highly engaged audiences that will drive action through the stories that you tell them with data. Thank you very much.